Greetings, lore masters. Tonight, our chronicle covers the glittering icy peaks and the profoundly dark depths of Solitude. We see the towering arch, the flags of the Empire snapping in the wind, the mighty blue palace presiding over the frozen sea of ghosts. But beneath the polished stones and the cheerful songs of the Bard's College, a rot settled in long ago, a bitterness that still clings to the air like frost. It's the story of a woman who defined an era, who tore an empire apart, and whose rage was so profound it refused to obey the simple boundary of death. We're talking, of course, about the Wolf Queen, Potema. Let's be honest, you probably just fast-travelled to the Blue Palace, grabbed a quest from Falk Firebeard, and ignored the warning whispers from the Hall of the Dead. Tonight, we listen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see where the stories are travelling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in the cold of Skyrim, but in the heart of the Empire, in the decadent gilded halls of the Imperial City. The year was 1E642, and the Septim dynasty was still settling into its power. The Emperor Pelagius II was a man described by history as kind. And in the Imperial City, kind is often just another word for weak. He and his wife, Kintira, already had one son, Antiochus, a boy who even in his youth showed a powerful inclination toward the seedier, more indulgent side of courtly life. Into this world a daughter was born. She was not a quiet child. From the moment she entered the world, she seemed to possess an awareness, an intensity that unsettled the midwives and tutors. This was Potema. She was, by all accounts, brilliant. She learned statecraft the way other children learn games, watching the vipers in her father's court. She saw how they smiled while sliding daggers, how they bowed while plotting treason. And she didn't just learn, she excelled. By the age of 10, she was rumoured to be advising her own father, pointing out spies and suggesting political manoeuvres that were shockingly effective, if unnervingly ruthless. But it wasn't just her mind that was sharp. It was her spirit. She was fiery, demanding, and possessed a white-hot ambition that was seen as unseemly in a daughter meant to be a political bargaining chip. Her younger brothers, Cephorus and Magnus, were born after her. They were, like their father, more stable, more predictable. Cephorus was stoic and militaristic. Magnus was quiet and scholarly. Potema, however, was a tempest. It's written in the first volume of The Wolf Queen, a book you can find scattered across Skyrim, that at the tender age of 14, she was already a consummate actress and a mistress of intrigue. She would pit courtiers against one another for sport, watching the fallout with a detached, chilling amusement. This is where the whispers begin, the details that separate Potema from a mere political shark. Core in-game fact. The book, The Wolf Queen, notes that she was a young sorceress of no small talent. This wasn't just a princess dabbling in restoration spells to impress her tutors. The rumours in the imperial court were far darker. They spoke of forbidden tomes vanishing from the arcane university, of hushed rituals in the dead of night, of servants disappearing. Potema was not just learning politics, she was learning power in its rawest and most primal form. She was particularly fascinated with the tales of the Dureni, the ancient Aldmeri clan known for their mastery of necromancy and daedric summoning. While her brother Antiochus was chasing women and wine, Potema was allegedly studying how to bind the dead. You have to wonder what family dinners were like in the White Gold Tower. You think your uncle's political rants are bad? Try sitting across from your sister who smells faintly of grave dust and is practicing low-level enchantments on the soup spoon. It lends a certain tension to the meal. Her father, Emperor Pelagius II, was terrified of her. He loved her perhaps, but he saw the wolf in her, a name she supposedly earned for her cunning and predatory nature at court. He saw her ambition, and he saw where it was aimed, the ruby throne. She held open contempt for her older brother Antiochus. She saw him as a weak, slovenly creature, unworthy of the power he was destined to inherit. She, Potema, was the one who deserved to rule. She had the mind, the will, and the strength. The fact that tradition placed her wastrel brother ahead of her was an insult she would never, ever forgive. This brings us to a long-running debate among Tamrielic scholars and modern fans alike. Was Potema born evil, or was she forged into a monster by a system that denied her? Some argue that her Septim blood, the blood of Tiber Septim himself, was already prone to extremes, greatness or madness. They suggest she may have been touched by a Daedric prince at birth, perhaps Molag Bal or Vermina, predisposing her to darkness. Fan theory doesn't bait. There's a persistent theory that Potema's rage was a symptom of the Septim bloodline's curse, the same one that would later famously consume her nephew, Pelagius the Mad. Others take a more sympathetic, or at least pragmatic view. They see a woman of unparalleled genius trapped in a deeply patriarchal system. Her ambition would have been celebrated in a son, but in a daughter it was seen as dangerous and unnatural. Her only path to power was through a man, either her father, her brother, or a husband. Her study of necromancy in this light wasn't an act of inherent evil, but the ultimate power grab. What is more absolute than commanding legions that cannot be killed, that do not fear, and that obey without question? She wasn't just trying to shatter the glass ceiling, she was trying to raise the dead to tear the entire building down. As she grew into womanhood, her power and her reputation only intensified. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a harsh, intimidating beauty. Men were drawn to her like moths to a flame, and just as easily burned. She toyed with them, used them for her political schemes, and discarded them. Her father knew he couldn't control her. She was a poisoned dagger waiting for the right moment to strike, and her target was the very line of succession. Pelagius III did the only thing he could think of. He couldn't disown her. She was too popular with certain factions who admired her strength. He couldn't imprison her. She was too cunning and would likely have the guards replaced with undead minions within a week. So he did the classic medieval dad move. He decided to marry her off. But who would take such a woman? Who would be brave or foolish enough to marry the Wolf Queen? The husband would need to be strong, far from the imperial city, and in a position of such power that the marriage would look like a brilliant political alliance rather than the desperate exile it truly was. His eyes turned north, to the frozen, rugged kingdom of Skyrim, specifically to the ancient and powerful city-state of Solitude. Solitude was ruled by King Antiochus, a man twice Potema's age. He was a shrewd, hardy Nord, a widower, and a powerful monarch in his own right. Obscure lore tidbit. What's often forgotten is that Solitude at this time wasn't just a part of Skyrim, it was its own kingdom, often rivaling the power of the High King at Windhelm. Antiochus was a significant player. The arrangement was made. Potema, just 19 years old, would be sent north to marry the old King of Solitude. Pelagius II must have breathed a sigh of relief. He had solved the problem. He had sent his dangerous, necromantic, ambitious daughter to the most remote part of the continent. She would be queen of a cold, isolated city, and he and Antiochus would be safe. He had, of course, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He hadn't exiled his daughter. He had just given her a kingdom. He had given the wolf her own pack, and her own mountain to howl from. Potema was not being sent away. She was being unleashed. As she sailed from Anvil, watching the white gold tower disappear, she wasn't mourning her exile. She was planning her return. She was going to Solitude to build an army, to bear a son, and to take the throne that she believed was hers by right, by wit, and by force. The War of the Red Diamond hadn't started yet, but its first, cold foundations were being laid. The journey north was, to put it mildly, unpleasant. Potema, who had been raised in the relative comfort of the imperial city, even if it was a nest of vipers, it was a warm nest, was not prepared for the biting, relentless winds of the Sea of Ghosts. The ship pitched and yawed. The air smelled of salt and something ancient and cold. When the city of Solitude finally came into view, it was less a beacon of hope and more a fortress of stone challenging the sky. The great natural arch was impressive, she'd grant it that, but the city perched atop it looked less like a capital and more like a glorified military outpost. Her husband-to-be, King Antiochus, was waiting for her. He was old, a classic grizzled Nord monarch with a beard that had seen more winters than Potema had seen harvests. He was broad, powerful, and carried the weight of his station with a quiet dignity. But to Potema, he was just a tool, a means to an end. Her father, Pelagius II, had thought he was sending his troublesome daughter to a remote icebox to be managed by a firm hand. The old man had it backward. Potema wasn't being managed, she was being given a forge. The wedding was a suitably grand, if barbaric, affair. There was mead, loud songs, and probably an uncomfortable amount of roasted meat. Potema played the part of the radiant, dutiful bride perfectly, her imperial grace a stark contrast to the rough-hewn Nords of her new court. She smiled, she deferred, and all the while she was taking notes. She was assessing every jarl, every thane, every captain of the guard. Who was loyal to Antiochus? Who was ambitious? Who was stupid? Who could be bought? And who would need to be removed? Antiochus was, by all accounts, quite taken with his young, fiery wife. He saw her brilliance and mistook it for youthful passion. He gave her free rein over the court, a decision he would not live long enough to truly regret. And so, Potema began her work. The Blue Palace, which players in the Fourth Era know as the relatively civilized home of Jarl Elisif, became Potema's personal headquarters. She began to change it subtly at first. She introduced imperial customs, Cyrodiilic fashions, and a level of courtly intrigue that the Nords of Solitude had never seen. She replaced the old, grizzled advisors, men who had served Antiochus faithfully for decades, with her own people. Some were sycophants she brought with her from the imperial city. Others were local Nords who saw which way the wind was blowing and quickly bent their knee to the new, sharp-witted queen. Solitude was no longer just a mead hall with a throne. It became a web, and Potema sat in the centre. She established a spy network that reached every corner of Skyrim, from the docks of Windhelm to the mines of Markarth. She learned the secrets of every noble family, their debts, their vices, their hidden shames. She didn't just rule with her husband, she ruled around him. Antiochus, content in his old age, was happy to let his brilliant wife handle the tiresome day-to-day business of state. He was still the king, but she was the power. Then, in 1E661, Potema did the one thing required of her. She produced an heir, a son. She named him Uriel. And just to make sure her father and brother back in Cyrodiil got the message, she gave him the dynastic name, Uriel Septim III. It was the most public, audacious screw you in the history of the Third Empire. She wasn't just the Queen of Solitude, she was the mother of a Septim, a claimant to the Ruby Throne. The birth of Uriel changed everything. For Antiochus, it was the crowning achievement of his life, securing his bloodline. For Potema, it was the forging of her primary weapon. She doted on the boy, but it was the doting of a weapons master polishing their favourite blade. She filled his head with stories of his destiny, of the injustice done to his mother, of the weak, corrupt man, her brother Antiochus, who was warming the throne that rightfully belonged to him. Now, Antiochus was not a young man when he married Potema. He had been married before. The second volume of The Wolf Queen mentions, almost as an afterthought, that Antiochus did have other children from his first wife. So what happened to them? History is strangely silent on the matter. It's one of those quiet, dark corners of lore where you have to read between the lines. Isn't it convenient that none of them were around to challenge the claim of Potema's golden boy Uriel? One can only imagine the unfortunate hunting accidents, the sudden, unseasonable illnesses, and the tragic shipwrecks that must have plagued Antiochus' original heirs. Oh, they all decided to take a holiday in the Sea of Ghosts during a typhoon. At the same time, how dreadfully unlucky. Potema, of course, was there to comfort her grieving husband, her own son, now the undisputed sole heir to the Kingdom of Solitude. This, naturally, leads to one of the community's darker and more persistent theories. Was Uriel III even Antiochus' son? The king was old. Potema was young, vital, and known to be persuasive. Some fans speculate Uriel III was fathered by a court favourite, a lover Potema kept to secure the one thing the old king might not have been able to provide. But the really dark theories, the ones whispered in the dusty corners of lore forums, suggest something else. They posit that Potema, already deep in her study of the dark arts, might not have left her son's conception to chance or a mere mortal lover. They whisper of Daedric pacts, of a ritual to ensure her son would be powerful, ambitious, and bound to the forces she commanded. Was Uriel III part Daedra? Probably not. But the fact that people even ask the question tells you everything you need to know about Potema's reputation. While she played the part of queen and mother in the halls of the Blue Palace, in the cellars and catacombs beneath the city, she continued her true work. Solitude, it turned out, was the perfect place for a budding necromancer. It was remote. It was built atop a massive arch, riddled with caves and ancient tunnels. The Hall of the Dead was, as always, conveniently stocked. The cold Skyrim nights were long and dark, perfect for study and experimentation. She delved into texts that would have gotten her burned in Cyrodiil. She made contact with darker, older powers. The Wolf Queen wasn't just a political nickname, it was becoming a literal truth. She was consorting with things that were not human, growing her power in the shadows, waiting. Antiochus, bless his oblivious heart, finally died. He passed away, leaving his kingdom not to his wife, that wouldn't be proper, but to his beloved son, Uriel III. But Uriel was still a boy. He would need a regent to rule in his stead until he came of age. And who else but his loving, devoted mother, Queen Potema? At last, the northern prize was hers. She was the absolute, undisputed ruler of Solitude, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Tamriel. She had a massive, loyal army. She had a son with a claim to the imperial throne, and she had a mastery of dark magic that no one in the empire truly understood. Back in the imperial city, her father, Pelagius II, had also died. Her despised, weak-willed brother, Antiochus, had taken the throne. He was, by all reports, a terrible emperor, profligate, decadent, and utterly uninterested in the tedious business of ruling. Potema, standing on the battlements of the Blue Palace, looked south. Her period of exile was over. Her time of preparation was complete. She had her kingdom, she had her heir, and she had her power. The game was finally about to begin. While Potema solidified her grip on the north, turning Solitude into her personal icy fortress, a different kind of decay was setting in down south. Her father, Pelagius II, finally shuffled off the mortal coil, reportedly dying of, well, something. History is vague, but given the family, one can't rule out acute relief or terminal disappointment. And so, the ruby throne passed as tradition dictated to the eldest son, Antiochus Septim. If Potema was a coiled serpent of ambition and dark magic, Antiochus was a puddle of lukewarm spilled wine. The imperial city, which had at least maintained a veneer of dignity under Pelagius, now dove headfirst into debauchery. The in-game biography of the Wolf Queen states, with almost academic dryness, that Antiochus's court was famous for its debauchery and licentiousness. This isn't just a historian being dramatic. We are talking about a level of partying that would make a Daedric prince blush. The White Gold Tower, the very symbol of imperial power and divine right, was turned into the Empire's most exclusive and most depraved nightclub. Antiochus himself led the charge. He was handsome, charming, and utterly devoid of a work ethic. He saw the imperial treasury not as a tool for governance, but as a personal bank account for funding his extravagant tastes. He spent days in a drunken haze, nights in the beds of countless paramours, of every conceivable gender and species the rumours claimed, and any time left over was dedicated to lavish festivals and games. He wasn't just a bad emperor, he was a cliché of a bad emperor. You have to imagine the sheer state of the palace. The cleaning staff must have quit en masse, and the carpets. Let's just say you wouldn't want to walk on them barefoot. Compounding the problem was his wife, the Empress Gothlida. Mentioned in The Wolf Queen, verse 3, Gothlida was not some long-suffering, pious woman trapped in a bad marriage. She was from a notoriously decadent and ancient Cyrodiilic family, and was, by all accounts, Antiochus's #1 party planner. They were a perfect match, enabling each other's worst impulses, all while the empire began to fray at the edges. Because while the emperor and empress were debating which vintage of Alto wine paired best with an orgy, the provinces were suffering. Roads fell into disrepair, banditry skyrocketed. Governors and dukes, seeing the total lack of leadership from the capital, began to skim, well, everything. They raised taxes for themselves, ignored imperial edicts, and started acting like petty kings. The Elder Council, that supposedly august body of wise men and women, wrung their hands, wrote sternly worded letters, and were summarily ignored. They were scandalized by the reports, but were too busy maneuvering for their own slice of the pie to actually do anything. And in Solitude, the Wolf Queen watched. Every report from her spies was a gift. Every story of Antiochus's latest public embarrassment, every petition from a starving border town, every frustrated letter from a council member, they were all meticulously filed away. Potema wasn't just enjoying her brother's failure, she was weaponizing it. She began her own, much more subtle political campaign. She sent letters of deep concern to the other rulers of Tamriel. To the Jarls of Skyrim, she was the dutiful daughter of the North, horrified by the southern decadence that threatened their hardy way of life. To the Dukes of High Rock, she was the voice of reason and stability, a true septim upholding the dignity of the bloodline. To the merchant princes of Hammerfell, she was the iron fist guaranteeing trade and order, a stark contrast to the chaos in Cyrodiil. She'd write things like, "It grieves my heart to see the throne of my father so stained. I pray for my brother's health, but I fear for the empire. My son, Uriel, however, has been studying the old ways. He reveres the law. He understands duty." It was a masterful performance. She was the concerned sister, the loving mother, the loyal subject, who just happened to be raising an army and suggesting her brother was unfit to rule. This, of course, brings up a crucial point of historical debate. Was Antiochus really this bad? Or was Potema the ancient Tamrielic equivalent of a media mastermind, running the most successful smear campaign in history? The truth, as it usually does, probably lies somewhere in the muck between. Our primary sources, the in-game books, were written after the bloody war that followed. It was very convenient for the victors to paint Antiochus as a degenerate monster and Potema as a power-mad witch. This justified the entire conflict. But many fans argue that Antiochus was likely just a mediocre ruler, not a comically evil one. He was probably lazy, self-indulgent, and a poor administrator. It was Potema's propaganda, whispered by her spies in every tavern and throne room, that magnified his failings, turning his personal vices into a genuine crisis of succession. She didn't just use the crisis, she manufactured it. Her son, Uriel III, was the centerpiece of this campaign. He was now a young man, raised from birth to believe the ruby throne was his. He had his mother's ambition but lacked her cunning. He had his supposed father's gnawed physique but lacked his gravitas. He was in essence a spoiled, arrogant princeling who genuinely believed his mother's hype. Potema paraded him before the courts of Skyrim, presenting him as the true heir, strong, pure and untainted by the rot of the south. The tension was building. The empire was dividing into two quiet factions. Those who, for the sake of stability, supported the traditional heir, Antiochus, and those who believed the empire needed a strong hand, and were falling for Potema's sales pitch. Potema's younger brothers, Sepphoris and Magnus, were caught in the middle. They were loyal to the empire and the throne. They were stationed in different parts of Tamriel, holding lands and titles of their own. They loved their sister, perhaps, but they feared her. And they loved their brother, Antiochus, but they were disgusted by him. They wrote letters to both, begging Antiochus to get his act together and begging Potema to remain loyal. Potema probably used their letters as kindling. She was done begging. She was done waiting. Her brother was a disgrace. Her son was a true septim. The nobles were restless. The people were unhappy. The crisis she had so carefully nurtured was finally ripe. All she needed was a spark. All she needed was one more unforgivable act from Antiochus, one final justification to move her pieces into place. The board was set. The wolf of Solitude was about to show her fangs, and the empire would bleed for it. The crisis that Potema had so meticulously cultivated finally broke, and it broke in a way that was almost poetic in its ambiguity. Her brother, the Emperor Antiochus, in a rare and stunningly ill-advised attempt at actually governing, had decided to personally lead a campaign against some borderland raiders. For a man whose primary physical exertions involved lifting a wine goblet and chasing courtesans through the palace, this was ambitious. He didn't even make it to the battle. Halfway to the front in the year 1E684, Antiochus Septim was taken ill and died. The imperial physicians, who were likely more experienced in treating hangovers and exotic diseases than battlefield malaise, were baffled. Was it a fever? Was it a lifetime of excess finally catching up with him? Or was it, as the whispers in the sculleries and barracks suggested, a very specific, very potent poison administered by a camp follower who looked suspiciously like one of Potema's agents? We'll never know. but the Wolf Queen's timing, as always, was impeccable. The news hit the imperial city like a physical blow. The debauched court was thrown into a sudden, sober panic. The Elder Council was convened in an emergency session, the sound of old men shouting at each other echoing through the white gold tower. The line of succession, for all of Antiochus's faults, was clear. He had a daughter, a single, legitimate child named Kintira. And so, Kintira too was proclaimed empress. She was, by every historical account, the polar opposite of her father. She was pious, intelligent, serious-minded, and deeply aware of the mess she was inheriting. The people of Cyrodiil, sick to death of Antiochus's catastrophic misrule, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Here, finally, was a ruler they could respect. They looked forward to an era of peace, austerity, and healing. They would not get it. When the news reached Solitude, Potema did not mourn her brother. She didn't celebrate his death. She raged. Not because she was sad, but because she was furious at the sheer, unmitigated gall of the Elder Council. For decades, her entire grievance, the bedrock of her ambition, was that she, a brilliant and capable woman, had been passed over in favour of her weak, incompetent brother. And now, these same old men, these bastions of imperial law, were tripping over themselves to crown another woman, the daughter of the very man she despised. The hypocrisy was so profound, so brazen, that it could not be borne. Potema, who had been denied the throne because of her gender, would now argue that another woman must be denied the throne because of her gender. The irony was lost on no one, and Potema did not care. She immediately launched her imperial gambit. Her argument was a twisted, cynical masterpiece. First, she dispatched riders to every allied jarl and duke, claiming that the Septim line could not pass through the female line. This was, of course, a rule she had entirely invented for the occasion. Her original claim was based on her own superiority, but now she shifted to pure, unadulterated legalism. But she needed more than that. She needed to disqualify Kintira entirely, and so she unleashed the accusation that had been festering in her mind for years. As recorded in the third volume of The Wolf Queen, Potema publicly and loudly accused Empress Kintira Tuku of being a bastard. She claimed Kintira was not the daughter of Antiochus at all, but the product of one of Empress Gothlida's many, many affairs. This was the political equivalent of a Daedric bomb. It was brilliant, it was unsubstantiated, and it was just plausible enough to work. Everyone knew about the debauchery of Antiochus's court. Everyone knew his wife was as licentious as he was. Who could say for sure who fathered whom in that den of iniquity? Potema didn't need to prove it. She just needed to plant the seed of doubt. This, of course, leads to one of the great fan debates of the era. Did Potema actually believe her own propaganda? Did she truly think Kintira was illegitimate? Almost certainly not. She was a master of information. She likely knew Kintira's parentage better than anyone, but she also knew that in politics, perception is reality. She created a truth that suited her narrative. By declaring Kintira a bastard, she was no longer just a disgruntled aunt. She was a righteous crusader, a defender of the true Septim bloodline. With Kintira disqualified, the throne was, in Potema's eyes, vacant. Her younger brothers, Sepphoris and Magnus, were still alive, but they were loyalists. They had made the fatal error of supporting Kintira, which in Potema's mind amounted to treason. She bypassed them entirely. The true heir, she proclaimed, the only one with pure Septim blood, uncontaminated by the southern rot, was her son. In the great hall of the Blue Palace, Potema staged her masterstroke. She invited every jarl in Skyrim, every allied lord from High Rock and Morrowind who had accepted her gold and her promises. Before a cheering crowd of Nords who adored their iron-willed queen, she brought forth her son, Uriel. She placed a crown upon his head, a crown she'd likely had commissioned years prior, just waiting for this moment. She proclaimed him Emperor Uriel Septim III, true ruler of Tamriel. This was the act that split the world. In the imperial city, the Elder Council, horrified, officially crowned Kintira too. Now there were two emperors. The red diamond, the sacred symbol of the dynasty, was shattered. This was the official, undeniable start of the bloody civil war that would be known to history as the War of the Red Diamond. The continent, which had been teetering on the edge, now fell screaming into the abyss. Every kingdom, every city, every noble family was forced to choose a side. Team Kintira, the Loyalists, was led by the empress herself and her two formidable uncles, Potema's own brothers. Sepphoris, a brilliant general, and Magnus, a wise administrator, rallied the kingdoms of Hammerfell, High Rock, and the core of Cyrodiil to their niece's banner. They saw her as the rightful legal ruler, and Potema as a power-mad traitor. Team Uriel, the rebels, was of course commanded by Potema. She was the real power, with her son as the handsome figurehead. She brought all of Skyrim, which she had ruled with an iron fist for decades, to her cause. She had also spent those decades wisely, forging alliances. She had promised the lords of Morrowind greater autonomy, and they, eager to throw off the imperial yoke, joined her. She had bribed and blackmailed several kingdoms in High Rock, creating a critical northern bloc. The war had begun. Potema, from her icy fortress in Solitude, had finally made her move. She had challenged the succession, crowned her son, and declared war on her own family. The time for whispers, propaganda, and shadow politics was over. The time for steel and for the raising of the dead had begun. The crown had barely settled on Uriel III's head in Solitude before the blood began to flow. The declaration of war wasn't a slow diplomatic unravelling. It was a sudden, violent tearing of the imperial fabric. Tamriel, which had been a single, sprawling and deeply dysfunctional family, was now in the midst of the worst possible divorce. The War of the Red Diamond was not a conflict of nations, but a war of brothers, sisters, uncles and nieces. It was the most brutal kind of war there is. From the north, Potema's armies surged. An entire generation of Nords, raised on tales of their Wolf Queen's brilliance and the south's decadent corruption, marched south under her banner. They were a wave of steel and fur, eager to prove their might. They were joined by the Dunmer legions from Morrowind, who, let's be honest, were probably just thrilled to have an officially sanctioned opportunity to kill Imperials. They saw this less as a war of succession, and more as a very convenient pest control program. This northern bloc was Potema's iron fist, and at its head rode her son, Uriel III, fancying himself a new Potema Septim, ready to conquer the continent. Facing them was the Rock of the Empire, the Loyalist faction. Potema's younger brother, Sepphoris, was a Septim of a different stripe. He was a general, a man of duty, and he was utterly appalled by his sister's treason. He rallied the imperial legions of Cyrodiil, at least those who hadn't been swayed by Potema's gold or her son's claim. Beside him stood the armies of Hammerfell, the Red Guards, honouring their treaties and possessing a deep cultural disdain for necromancy and imperial infighting, proved to be the Loyalists' most steadfast and deadly allies. The great kingdom of High Rock, in typical Breton fashion, immediately fractured, with various dukes and barons declaring for whichever side they thought would grant them more land, more titles, or simply had the scarier army. The initial battles were a slaughter. The Imperial Legion, the greatest fighting force in Tamriel's history, was now forced to fight itself. Veterans who had bled together in Black Marsh now found themselves on opposite sides of a shield wall, hacking at their old comrades. The war was fought in the snowy mountain passes of Skyrim, in the muddy fields of Cyrodiil, and in the very streets of High Rock cities. But Potema, of course, was not fighting a conventional war. She was the Wolf Queen, and she had an ace up her sleeve that her brothers, for all their military piety, could not match. Potema began to openly and on a massive scale practice the necromancy she had been perfecting for decades in the catacombs beneath Solitude. Why rely on mortal soldiers who needed to be paid, fed, and worst of all recruited? It was so inefficient. The war, for her, became a grimly sustainable enterprise. Every battle, win or lose, was a victory, because every battlefield was a recruitment drive. Her armies didn't just have Nords and Dunmer, they had support staff. Legions of the undead, shackled to her will, marched alongside the living. Soldiers who fell fighting for her were often seen back on the front lines just days later, their eyes replaced with the cold, blue glow of reanimated magic. You have to feel for the average Loyalist legionary. It's one thing to fight a screaming mead-fueled Nord. You can understand that. It's quite another to fight him, land a perfect killing blow, watch him fall, and then have to fight him again the next day, only now he smells significantly worse and doesn't stop coming just because you chopped his arm off. It's profoundly bad for morale. This, naturally, is where one of the great community debates rages. Was Potema's army really the endless tide of skeletons and zombies depicted in the more lurid tales? Or was this a brilliant propaganda move by Kepharos and the Loyalists? It's a classic demonization tactic. Paint your enemy as a monstrous baby-eating witch consorting with Daedra, and suddenly your own war of aggression looks like a holy crusade. The truth is almost certainly a horrifying mix of both. She was absolutely using necromancy on a scale that shocked Tamriel, and her enemies just as absolutely exaggerated it to galvanize their troops. It's a fun debate for a lore forum. Was she 100% full-blown corpse queen, or, just a part-time necromantic warlord? While Potema conducted her dark symphonies from Solitude, her son Uriel III was leading the charge. He was not his mother. He had her ambition, but none of her subtlety. He was a brute, leading from the front, and he managed to capture several key cities in northern Cyrodiil, carving a bloody path toward the imperial city itself. But the war ground to a halt. Sephiroth was a good general. He was a master of logistics and defense. He and his Red Guard allies formed a line, and Uriel's army, living and dead, could not break it. The war, which had begun with such velocity, now bogged down into a multi-year slog. It was a war of attrition, of sieges, of burned fields and salted earth. The continent bled, just as the bullet point said. This is where we find a strange, sad little piece of lore. One of the main in-game sources we have for this entire conflict, a book you can find in Skyrim and Oblivion called The War of the Red Diamond, is not a dry, dusty history text. It's a play, a piece of theatre in 5 acts. The single most devastating civil war in the history of the Third Empire, a conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and saw a sister feed her niece to the dogs, was later sanitized, given a narrative arc, and turned into an evening's entertainment for the masses. It's a bit like finding a jaunty Broadway musical about a plague. It's profoundly tacky and speaks volumes about how the Empire processes its own trauma. Back in the war, the stalemate was bad for Potema. An endless war drained her treasury, even if her soldiers were low cost. Her allies in Morrowind and High Rock were getting restless. She needed to break the stalemate, and she knew Uriel couldn't do it on the field. He was a hammer, and she needed a scalpel. She needed to break the will of the Loyalists. She needed to remove the symbol they were all fighting for. She had to eliminate the legitimate empress. Her spies, a network of shadow and whispers she had maintained for half a century, brought her news. Her niece, Empress Kintira VI, was planning a trip. Trying to appear as a ruler of the people, not a coward hiding in the White Gold Tower, Kintira was conducting a tour of southern Cyrodiil to shore up support. She would be in the city of Bravil, travelling with only her personal guard. Potema, from her cold throne in Solitude, smiled. It was a terrible, sharp-toothed expression. She diverted a legion. Not Nords, not Dunmer. These were her own troops, creatures and reanimated husks drawn from the darkest pits, led by vampire lords who owed her fealty. They were not to engage Sephiroth's army. They were to bypass it, moving only in darkness with the unnatural silent speed of the dead. Their target was not a fortress. It was a single pious woman in a walled city. The war was about to shift from the battlefield to the prison cell, and the Wolf Queen was about to commit an act so dark it would stain her name forever. Empress Kintira II arrived in Bravil under a heavy grey sky. Bravil, which even in the Third Era is kindly described as the armpit of Cyrodiil, was already a grim, damp city of canals and squalor. She was there to show the people that the heart of the Empire still beat, that their empress was with them. She was in every sense a good person, which is often a fatal flaw in a civil war. She held court in the city's gloomy castle. The local count was nervous, the guards were restless. But Kintira was serene. She listened to petitions, she promised aid, she prayed in the local chapel. That night she went to sleep, exhausted but believing she had done some good. The attack came just after midnight. It wasn't a siege. There was no sound of catapults or marching feet. There was only a sudden, suffocating silence. Sentries posted on the walls simply vanished. They didn't even have time to scream. Potema's elite force, the vampires, necromancers and reanimated horrors she had dispatched, moved like smoke. They rose from the canals, they slipped over the walls, and they passed through the barred gates like mist. The castle garrison, loyal and brave, was slaughtered in its sleep. The few who woke were cut down by pale, impossibly fast figures or dragged into the shadows by shambling corpses that felt no pain. Kintira's personal guard, the best of the Imperial Legion, made a valiant stand in the main hall, but they were trained to fight men, not nightmares. Their steel found purchase but seemed to do nothing. It was a massacre. Kintira was taken from her bed, dragged in her nightgown, and thrown into the very tower she had been staying in. The biography of the Wolf Queen, a book you can find on shelves from Solitude to the Imperial City, records this grimly. She was captured in Bravil and imprisoned in a high tower. The city fell in less than an hour, not to an army, but to a plague of monsters. For weeks, or perhaps months, time becomes a blur in such a place. Kintira was left there. The accommodations, as you might imagine, were not 5-star, probably not even 1-star. The review on the Imperial TripAdvisor would have been scathing. Damp, smells of mildew and despair. The room service is literally a bucket. Potema's forces now occupying the castle left her to rot. She was a bargaining chip, but Potema, being the galaxy-brain strategist she was, understood that a living empress was still a symbol of hope. She needed to break not just Kintira's body, but her spirit. The in-game play, The War of the Red Diamond, depicts her jailers, a term for jailers, as a coven of necromancers who tormented her day and night. They showed her visions, whispered lies of her uncle's deaths, of her army's defeats. They paraded her, gaunt and broken, before the magically bound spirits of her own fallen guards. It was a campaign of profound psychological torture. Back in the wider world, the news of her capture was a thunderclap. The Loyalists were stunned. Sepphoris and Magnus were beside themselves with grief and rage. The war, which had been a strategic conflict, now became a desperate rescue mission. Sepphoris, who was a brilliant general but apparently a terrible special ops planner, diverted a huge portion of his army from the main front to march on Bravil. This was exactly what Potema had anticipated. She had laid the perfect trap. The siege of Bravil was a disaster for the Loyalists. Gephorus's army, exhausted from a forced march, slammed itself against the walls of a city defended by the undead. They were met not just by arrows and stone, but by terrifying Daedric conjurations and legions of zombies who simply could not be routed by a cavalry charge. The city's canals, it was said, ran thick with the blood of the living and the reanimated dead, a grim, soupy mix. The siege was failing. Sepphoris, in a desperate last-ditch effort, managed to get a small team of commandos over the wall. They fought their way to the tower. They were too late. Potema, receiving word from her necromancers that the rescue was imminent, had given her final order. She could not, under any circumstances, allow Kintira to be retaken. A rescued empress would be a martyr, a miracle, a symbol 10 times more powerful than before. A dead empress, on the other hand, was just a corpse. And this is where the story takes its darkest, most infamous turn. Potema didn't just order her execution, she ordered an example. The in-game play, The War of the Red Diamond, Act 4, Scene 3, describes Kintira's fate. It is, without question, one of the most brutal acts in Tamrielic history. She was not beheaded, she was not poisoned, she was dragged from her cell, not by her captors, but by something else. She was, in the play's own words, brought to the dungeons, and given to a pack of dogs. The text says she was devoured. Now we must pause. This is a bedtime lore story, but that is something else. Let the image sit. The pious, gentle, legitimate Empress of Tamriel, betrayed, captured, tortured, and in her final moments fed to animals in a dark, stinking dungeon, all on the order of her own aunt. This brings us to a critical and somewhat desperate fan debate. Did this actually happen? The source, The War of the Red Diamond, is a play. It is a piece of theatre, written after the war by the victors. It is, in essence, loyalist propaganda. Is it possible, fans ask, that this story was an invention? A fabrication designed to paint Potema as the ultimate inhuman monster, to justify the bloody vengeance that Sepphoris was about to unleash? It seems so theatrically evil, so perfectly monstrous that it's hard to believe. The counter-argument, of course, is that Potema was that monstrous, that this was a calculated act of terror, a message to the world. This is what I do to my enemies. This is what I do to empresses. Surrender. The truth, as always, is lost. Perhaps she was just stabbed in her her body dumped in the canal. But the story that spread, the story that mattered, was the story of the dogs. When Sepphoris's men finally breached the tower, they found only an empty, blood-stained cell. The news of Kintira's death, and the manner of it, broke the siege. Sepphoris, heartbroken, was forced to retreat. But the loyalist army was no longer fighting for a monarch. It was fighting for revenge. The war had entered a new savage phase. Potema, sitting in solitude, had removed the enemy queen from the board. In doing so, she had also removed every last shred of mercy from the hearts of her brothers. The savage, brutal murder of Empress Kintira II had done precisely what Potema intended. It decapitated the loyalist faction, removing its figurehead and its primary symbol of legitimacy. Her brother Sepphoris's army, heartbroken and spiritually broken, had staggered back from the disastrous siege of Breville. The road to the imperial city, long blocked by Sepphoris's tactical genius, was now wide open. Uriel Septim III, who had been waging a grinding, bloody and frankly unimpressive campaign in northern Cyrodiil, seized his moment. With the main loyalist army in disarray, he marched his forces, the legions of Nords, Dunmer and the ever-present, ever-shambling undead, south. In the year 1E 687, Uriel III, the son of the Wolf Queen, marched into the imperial city. It was not a liberation. There were no crowds cheering, no flowers thrown. The citizens of the capital, who had adored the pious Kintira, barred their doors and shuttered their windows. They looked on in silent terror as Potema's son, flanked by grim-faced Nord housecarls and shadowy figures that seemed to drink the light, rode to the white gold tower. He was formally crowned Emperor Uriel Septim III. He sat upon the ruby throne. Potema, it seemed, had won. This was the wolf's apex. Her son was the emperor. Her enemies were in retreat. Her name was spoken in terrified whispers from the sands of Elsewhere to the peaks of High Rock. And yet Potema did not go to the imperial city. She did not stand next to her son at his coronation. She did not move her court south to bask in the glory she had spent a lifetime fighting for. She remained in solitude. This, right here, is the key. As the biography of the Wolf Queen dryly notes, while Uriel III reigned in Cyrodiil, Potema ruled in solitude. The imperial city was a branch office. The true capital of the Tamrielic Empire for this brief dark window was the Blue Palace. Uriel was a puppet emperor, a glorified regional governor for his mother, who held the real levers of power from her icy northern throne. You have to imagine the letters. Uriel III, puffed up with his new title, sitting in the emperor's chair, would receive a daily courier. Not a man on a horse, but perhaps a skeletal rider on a skeletal steed, or a silent, pale creature that arrived in the dead of night. The message would be from Mother, and it would not be a suggestion. It would be a list of orders. Appoint this Dunmer to the Elder Council. Raise taxes on that count in Skingrad. Move 3 legions to the Valenwood border. Uriel III, for his part, was a terrible ruler. He had all of his mother's ambition and none of her cunning. He was a bully, a brute, who suddenly found himself the most powerful man in the world, and he acted like it. He immediately began a purge of the imperial city, executing any noble or council member suspected of loyalty to Kintira. He replaced them with his own men, crude Nord jarls who knew nothing of Cyrodiilic lore and ambitious Breton lords who had backed his claim. The White Gold Tower, which had briefly been a place of quiet prayer under Kintira, once again became a place of debauchery. Only this time it was a grim, joyless debauchery, full of paranoia and cruelty. While Uriel was busy being a terrible boss, Potema was busy being a terrifying one. The in-game play, The War of the Red Diamond, mentions that her court in Solitude became a place of profound dread. It was no longer just a court of mortals. She held audiences with shadowy figures, with Daedric emissaries, with ancient vampire lords. She was consolidating her real power. She was making pacts, binding more powerful souls, learning darker secrets. She wasn't just a necromancer. She was the high priestess of a new, dark religion, and the entire empire was her unwilling congregation. This, of course, leads to one of the great debates about this period. What was Uriel III's real role in all this? Was he a willing participant in his mother's dark arts, or was he, like everyone else, terrified of her? The sources are quiet on his personal beliefs. One popular theory posits that Uriel III was a puppet in every sense of the word. He was raised to be a weapon, and now that he was emperor, He was trapped. He did what his mother said because he had seen firsthand what she did to her enemies. He had no desire to end up as a reanimated corpse scrubbing the floors of the Blue Palace. Another, darker theory suggests he was a true believer, an antichrist figure who shared his mother's thirst for necromantic power and was eagerly awaiting the day her undead legions would grant him total control free from her. But the war was not over. The apex is, by definition, the point just before the fall. Potema's two other brothers, Sepphoris and Magnus, were still very much alive. They had been beaten, but not destroyed. Sepphoris, a general to his bones, had retreated to his strongest base of support, Hammerfell. The Red Guards, with their deep cultural hatred of the undead, were his most fervent allies. They had seen what Potema and her son had done to the Empire, and they were preparing for a holy war. Magnus, the scholar, had gone to High Rock using his diplomatic skill to rally the kingdoms that were horrified by Kintira's murder. The Empire was effectively split in three. Potema and Uriel held the north and centre, the Loyalists held the west and parts of the south. It was an unstable, untenable situation. Uriel III, in his arrogance, decided he would be the one to end it. He was emperor, after all. He was tired of his uncles nipping at his heels, and perhaps he was tired of his mother pulling his strings. He needed a real victory, one that was his alone. Against the advice of his more cautious generals, and we can assume, against the screamingly worded letters from his mother, Uriel III gathered his army. He drained the imperial city of its defenders, conscripted every able-bodied man he could find, and supplemented them with his mother's gifts. He marched his army west toward Hammerfell. He was going to crush Sepphoris and end the war. He was a fool. He was leaving the safety of the imperial city, a fortress, to march his army across hostile territory into the homeland of his enemy. Sepphoris, the superior general, didn't even have to fight him in Hammerfell. He and Magnus manoeuvred their combined forces, forcing Uriel III to meet them on ground of their choosing. The place was a small, unassuming city in High Rock near the border of Hammerfell. It was a place called Ichidag. The wolf's apex was over. The tide was about to turn. Uriel Septim III rode at the head of his army, and he felt for the first time like a true emperor. He was free from his mother's suffocating, micromanaging presence. He was out of the gloomy, whispering halls of the Blue Palace and the paranoid, stale air of the White Gold Tower. He was a warrior king, a new Potema Septim, about to personally crush the last remnants of his family's pathetic rebellion. His army was a magnificent, terrifying sight. Legions of grim Nord veterans, supplemented by Dunmer mercenaries and, of course, the ever-present silent ranks of the reanimated dead. He was invincible. He was a fool. His uncles, Sepphoris and Magnus, were anything but. They had allowed Uriel to march deep into their territory, stretching his supply lines thin over the rocky, unforgiving terrain of High Rock. They were not just fighting a war, they were enacting a blood vengeance. They were fighting for their murdered niece Kintira, and they had drawn Uriel to a place of their choosing, the city of Ichidag. The battle that followed was not the glorious charge Uriel had envisioned. It was a tactical masterpiece of slaughter. The Battle of Ichidag, as it would come to be known, was the decisive turning point in the War of the Red Diamond. Sepphoris, the general, used his highly disciplined Red Guard cavalry to outflank and shatter Uriel's living troops. Magnus, the administrator, had spent months ensuring the local Breton kingdoms were not just allied, but furious, supplying militia and mages who fought with the desperate ferocity of people defending their homes. Uriel's trump card, his undead legions, proved less effective than he'd hoped. The Red Guards of Hammerfell, whose culture possesses a deep-seated, almost religious hatred for necromancy, were prepared. They had their own priests and mages, who consecrated the very ground and turned Potema's dark magic back on itself. The reanimated corpses, so terrifying to panicked peasants, crumbled into dust against the righteous, sun-fueled magic of the Alika. The battle turned into a rout. Uriel's army broke. The Nords, seeing their emperor in disarray, fought bravely but were surrounded. The Dunmer, being pragmatic mercenaries, saw a losing fight and simply left. They melted away, deciding their contracts did not include a clause for being on the losing side of a holy war. Uriel III was suddenly shockingly alone. His personal guard was cut down, and he was thrown from his horse. The Emperor of Tamriel was now just a man in very expensive, very muddy armour, scrambling in the dirt. He was not captured by his uncle Sepphoris. He was not taken prisoner by a noble Breton knight who would have ransomed him back to his mother. He was found cowering in a ditch by a group of local farmers armed with pitchforks, scythes, and a profound hatred for the man who had brought war to their doorstep. The 6th volume of The Wolf Queen, a book players can find lying around. Dungeons in Skyrim describes this moment with chilling simplicity. It says Uriel III was captured, but not by the army. He was taken by a lynch mob during the battle. This wasn't a capture, it was an interception. These people didn't see an emperor, they didn't see a septim, they saw the son of the Wolf Queen, the man whose undead armies had burned their crops, the tyrant whose tax collectors had taken their last coin. They dragged him from the ditch. He probably shouted his name, his title, he probably made threats, he probably begged. It made no difference. To them he was just a monster, and they were going to do what one does with monsters. They didn't wait for Sepphoris, they didn't wait for a trial. The mob, in its blind, collective rage, became its own judge, jury, and executioner. The Emperor Uriel III, the man Potema had crowned in Solitude, was beaten, stabbed, and torn apart by a crowd of enraged peasants. They didn't just kill him, they obliterated him. This leads to one of the war's most grim and persistent fan theories. What exactly did they do with the body? The official histories say he was killed by a mob. But given the context, the sheer terror of necromancy, the hatred for his mother, many in the lore community believe his death was far more specific. The theory holds that the mob, terrified that Potema could reanimate her son even from afar, did the only thing they could. They tore his body limb from limb. They burned the pieces in separate pyres. Some stories claim they salted the earth, and that his head was put on a pike, his mouth stuffed with hallowed salts to prevent his spirit from being summoned. It was a brutal, pagan, and utterly final act, meant to defy the very laws of magic his mother commanded. They weren't just killing a man, they were trying to delete his soul. When Sepphoris and Magnus finally rode into the village, there was no prisoner to take. There was only a mess, and a grimly satisfied populace. The tide had not just turned, it had crashed down and washed away Potema's entire claim. With Uriel III dead, Potema's northern alliance dissolved overnight. Her son was the only thing holding it together. The Dunmer were gone. The rebellious Breton lords quickly, and with truly impressive speed, swore fealty to Sepphoris, claiming they had been misled and tricked by Potema all along. Even the Nords, leaderless and broken, began the long, cold march back to Skyrim, their taste for southern wars completely soured. The news travelled north, faster than any army. It reached the imperial city, where Uriel's puppet council fled in the night, throwing open the gates for the approaching loyalist army. And it reached Solitude. Potema, the Wolf Queen, stood in the Blue Palace, perhaps looking out over the frozen sea of ghosts. A messenger, pale and trembling, would have delivered the news. Her son, her heir, her weapon, the entire purpose of her 50-year-long game, dead, not in noble combat, not by his uncle's sword, but torn to pieces by farmers. The grief and the rage must have been absolute. It must have been a physical force, a scream that shattered ice. She had lost. Her gambit had failed. Her brothers were victorious. Sepphoris, now the undisputed hero of the Empire, was marching to the imperial city, where the Elder Council would, without a shadow of a doubt, proclaim him the new emperor. Potema was no longer a rival empress. She was a traitor, a murderer, and now she was a cornered animal, a grieving mother with nothing left to lose, and a grieving mother with an unparalleled mastery of necromancy and a direct line to several Daedric princes is the most dangerous thing in the history of Tamriel. The war for the Empire was over. The war against Solitude was about to begin. The news of Ichidag and its grisly aftermath did not just travel north, it crawled. It was a story told in hushed, terrified whispers by refugees, by deserters, and by the few lucky merchants who had escaped the warpath. When the official confirmation finally reached Solitude, it was a mere formality. The Wolf Queen already knew. She had likely felt it. That sudden, final severing of the bond to the son she had forged into a weapon, only to have him shatter. There, in the great hall of the Blue Palace, Potema Septim, the Wolf Queen, did not weep. She did not collapse into a fit of sorrow. The grief she experienced was something far colder, far heavier. It was the grief of a collapsed star, a density of rage and loss so profound that it warped the very air around her. Her son was gone. Her claim was gone. Her allies were, at that very moment, bending the knee to her brother Sepphoris, begging his forgiveness and offering him their swords. In the imperial city, the transition was swift. Emperor Sepphoris III was crowned by the Elder Council, hailed as the saviour of the empire, the man who had avenged the sainted Kintira and ended the aspirations of the traitor queen. His first act as emperor was not one of reconciliation. It was not to rebuild. His first act was to declare his sister Potema an enemy of the state, a monster to be hunted, and a traitor to be destroyed. He began to marshal the full, undivided might of the Imperial Legion. He was not just going to defeat her, he was going to scour her from the face of Tamriel. This was the end of Potema the politician. This was the end of Potema the rival queen. This was the birth of Potema the monster. She had nothing left to lose. There was no throne to win, no son to champion. There was only her grief, her power, and the single, burning desire to make the world that had taken her son from her suffer. If she could not rule Tamriel, she would make it bleed. If Sepphoris wanted a war, she would give him a war that would make the War of the Red Diamond look like a tavern brawl. She retreated, not from her city, but from her mortality. She descended into the catacombs beneath Solitude, the winding, dark tunnels that she had used as her laboratory for decades. But this was no longer study. This was a full, unrestrained embrace of the dark. She had dabbled before, binding souls, raising the dead, consorting with lesser Daedra. Now she dove headfirst into the abyss. She performed rituals that had not been seen since the days of the Dureni, rituals that the Aelids in their darkest depths would have found distasteful. The in-game book, The Wolf Queen, verse 6, states that she made unholy alliances with the Daedra. It doesn't specify which ones, but we can make some educated guesses. She was bartering. What was she offering? Her city? Her loyalty? Her own soul, piece by piece? She would have gladly offered it all. In return, she demanded power. Power to command the dead on a scale never before imagined. Power to summon things that mortals were not meant to see. Power to make her city impregnable. Power to make her brother's victory so costly it would feel like a defeat. This is where a truly dark fan theory emerges. What was the first thing she tried to do with this new, terrible power? Many in the lore community believe her immediate goal wasn't to fight Sepphoris, but to find her son. She wasn't just grieving, she was trying to get Uriel back. She had his soul, she must have believed, bound to her as she had bound so many others. She would call him back from the void, from Aetherius, from wherever he had gone. But, as the theory goes, she couldn't. The Mob at Ikkedag, in their primal pagan fury, had so utterly destroyed his body, had so specifically used hallowed salts and fire to sever his spirit, that he was gone, even to her. She, the greatest necromancer of the age, could not find the one soul she actually wanted. It was this final, ultimate failure, this last screw you from the world, that snapped the final thread of her sanity. Her humanity bled away in those dark tunnels. Her court, the mortal lords and ladies who had served her, were repurposed. Some fled, most did not. They became her first new courtiers. They became her sacrifices. They became her undead chamberlains, her skeletal guards, her vampiric advisors. Solitude began to change. The city that had once been a bastion of imperial power in the north became a necropolis. A cloud of unnatural cold, even for Skyrim, settled over the Great Arch. The living citizens of Solitude, the merchants, the bards, the families, were trapped. Some were butchered and reanimated as a grisly workforce. Others were kept alive, a cowering, terrified herd of livestock in their own homes, a larder for her more discerning supernatural allies. The Bard's College, that place of light and song, went silent. The marketplace fell quiet, save for the shuffle of fleshless feet. Solitude became, in every sense of the word, a city of the dead. Potema herself was changing. The dark magic she commanded was exacting its price. Her beauty, which had been sharp and predatory, began to decay. Her flesh grew taut. Her eyes sank, but her power grew. She was no longer just a sorceress. She was becoming a lich, a being of pure, malevolent will, bound to the mortal plane only by her bottomless hate. Emperor Sepphoris, meanwhile, was marching. His legions were vast, hardened by years of civil war, and now galvanized by a singular righteous purpose. They were joined by the vigilance of Stendar, by priests, by battle mages from the newly reformed Mages Guild. This was not a campaign, it was a crusade. They marched north, into the cold of Skyrim, to put down the cornered wolf. They expected to lay siege to a city. They had no idea they were about to lay siege to hell itself. Potema was ready for them. She stood on the battlements of the Blue Palace, a gaunt, terrifying figure. She was no longer a queen. She was a force of nature. And as she watched the first banners of the Imperial Legion appear on the horizon, she raised her arms and began the symphony of her final, terrible masterpiece. The greatest army in Tamriel stood on the frozen hills opposite the Great Stone Arch of Solitude, and for the first time in its long, proud history, the Imperial Legion was truly afraid. They had marched north under the banners of their new Emperor Sepphoris, fueled by a righteous holy rage. They were there to put down a traitor, a witch, a murderer. They were prepared for a hard fight, a brutal siege against desperate Nords and their bitter queen. They were not prepared for what they found. The city of Solitude was silent. No sentries walked the battlements. No taunts were shouted from the walls. The great banners of the Wolf Queen hung limp, tattered and stained with something dark that wasn't dye. A frigid, unnatural fog, which you can still feel in the Halfinger marshes on a bad night, clung to the city, deadening all sound. It was a tomb that was watching them. Emperor Sepphoris, a general to his corps, gave the order. The formalities had to be observed. The trebuchets were loaded. With a great groan of wood and rope, the first boulders were hurled. They struck the walls of Solitude, and the legion's blood ran cold. The stones didn't just hit. They seemed to be caught. Dark energy, a web of purple and black magic, flared where they struck. The stones turned to dust, and the wall, which should have been cracked, seemed to heal. There was a moment of stunned silence from the legion's command. The battle mages looked at each other, their faces pale. This was not structural engineering, this was something else. "The gate," Sepphoris commanded, his voice tight. "Take the gate." The battering ram, a massive oak trunk named Stendar's Fist by the hopeful legionaries, was trundled forward. The soldiers advanced in their testudo formation, shields locked, marching in perfect, grim unison. They got within 50 yards of the gate when it opened. It didn't swing wide on its hinges, it unravelled. The solid wood and iron bars seemed to melt into a swarm of shrieking, shadowy bats, which vanished into the unnatural fog. In the black, yawning gateway stood Potema. She was not the woman she had been. She was a gaunt, skeletal figure, draped in rotting finery, her eyes blazing with the cold, blue light of the grave. She raised one hand. She did not speak. And from the darkness behind her, the true army of Solitude poured out. It was not an army of Nords, it was a tide of death. The in-game history, the Wolf Queen vs. 7, which the Dragonborn can find during their own grim adventure, describes the horror of this siege. It states that, as the city's defenders fell, they were reanimated to fight again. This wasn't just a handful of zombies, this was an industrial-scale, automated recycling program for corpses. The front ranks of Potema's army were the freshly dead, the citizens of Solitude, their faces frozen in the rictus of their final moments, now clad in mismatched armour, their eyes glowing with that same terrible blue light. Behind them came the ancient dead. Draugr, whom Potema had ripped from their slumber in every tomb in Halfingr, marched in their rusted ancient armour, wielding weapons that hadn't seen the sun in 1,000 years, and behind them were the things, flesh atronachs, stitched together from the parts of men and beasts, vampires, moving as pale blurs, tearing through the legion's front lines, and at the back, floating just above the ground, were the liches, Potema's inner circle, her sorcerers who had followed her into undeath, and they began to counter the imperial battle mages with spells that didn't just burn, but stole the soul. The legion, to its credit, did not break. They were the best, they charged, and the siege of Solitude began. It was not a siege, it was a charnel house, it was an abattoir. The legion would fight all day, gaining perhaps 10 feet of ground, their swords and holy magic cutting down swaths of the undead. They would fall back at night, exhausted, to their fortified camps. And in the morning, they would wake to find that every single enemy they had killed was back on its feet, standing in the exact same place. And, to their profound, soul-crushing horror, so was every legionary who had fallen the day before, now wearing Imperial armour but fighting for the Wolf Queen. Imagine the sheer psychological trauma. You're a soldier. You have to kill a zombie. That's bad enough. Then you have to kill your friend Steve from the barracks, who you shared a bottle of mead with 3 nights ago. Steve is now a zombie, and he's trying to eat your face. Morale wasn't just low, it was non-existent. The Imperial Quartermaster probably had a breakdown just trying to manage the logistics of it. "Sir, we've lost 500 swords. How?" "We stabbed 500 zombies, sir, and then they kept the swords, and are now stabbing us back with our swords. This nightmare didn't last a week, it didn't last a month." The war's own histories state that the Siege of Solitude lasted for the better part of a decade. 10 years, an entire decade of the Imperial Legion being fed day after day into a literal meat grinder. Sephorus's hair went from black to grey on that frozen battlefield. He built permanent fortresses, not just camps, ringing the city. He rotated legions in and out, sending the survivors, the hollow-eyed men who had seen too much, back to Cyrodiil, and bringing in fresh, naive recruits. This leads to one of the community's darkest and most logical debates. What about the living people of Solitude? The city wasn't just corpses, at first. The horrifying theory is that Potema kept them. She didn't kill them all at once. She kept a larder. She had thousands of living mortals trapped inside the walls, a captive herd. They were used for parts, to create her flesh abominations. They were used as sacrifices to power the Daedric pacts that fueled her magic. They were used as food for her vampire allies. For 10 years, the citizens of Solitude lived in an apocalypse, hiding in their cellars, listening to the screams as their queen and her monsters farmed them like cattle. But even a nightmare must end. The Empire, for all its losses, had one thing Potema did not: a near-infinite supply of living reinforcements. Potema was working with a finite number of bodies in Skyrim. After a decade, her army was being worn down. Her Daedric pacts were fraying. The Imperial battle mages, after 10 years of the most practical high-stakes final exam ever, had finally figured out how to break her wards. They learned to consecrate the ground so the dead could not rise. They forged new enchantments. Slowly, painfully, an inch at a time, the Legion advanced. They took the gate. They moved into the city. The city, by this point, was unrecognisable. It was a ruin of bones and despair. The legionaries, now hardened veterans of this specific grotesque war, moved from house to house, cleansing them with fire and magic. They fought their way through the ruined marketplace, past the silent Bard's College, up the hill to the Blue Palace. They found the palace empty. The great hall was stained, the throne was cold. Sephorus, now an old bitter man, knew she wasn't there. There was only one place left for the cornered wolf to go. She had retreated to her den, her true throne room, the catacombs. The soldiers who entered the catacombs beneath the Blue Palace were not the same men who had marched north 10 years prior. They were the survivors, the cleansers they called themselves, a grim, hollow-eyed fraternity of veterans who had specialised in one thing: killing what was already dead. They were led by Emperor Sephorus himself, his face a mask of iron-grey exhaustion, his sword no longer shining, but stained with a decade of unnatural frost and desiccated gore. The descent was quiet. That was the worst part. For 10 years the air had been full of shrieks, the clash of steel on bone, and the sizzle of holy magic. Now there was only the drip, drip, drip of water in the dark and the crunch of their own boots on a carpet of bone dust and filth. The magic was broken. Potema's great web of necromantic energy, which had held the city in its thrall, had been torn apart by the Imperial battle mages. As the legionaries descended, they saw the evidence of its failure. Undead sentries who should have sprung to attack were slumped against the walls, just inert. They were puppets with their strings cut. Skeletons had collapsed into tidy piles of bone, as if the will holding them together had simply evaporated. It was profoundly, deeply anticlimactic. They moved deeper, their torches cutting weak circles into a darkness that felt ancient and hateful. The walls were covered in runes, scrawled in what looked like dried blood and crushed minerals. They passed alcoves filled with failed experiments, half-formed flesh abominations floating in murky vials, heaps of limbs that had been stitched together and then discarded. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, mildew, and something else, something like a slaughterhouse that had been sealed for a century. One of the younger legionaries, a Breton mage, gagged. "By the eight," he whispered, "what was she doing down here?" An old Nord sergeant next to him just grunted, not taking his eyes off the shadows. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to, boy. Just watch the corners." This, of course, is where the great historical debate lies. What was the actual cause of Potema's death? The soldiers advancing into that pit were expecting a final boss fight. They were expecting Potema, the Lich Queen, a being of immense power, sitting on a throne of skulls, ready to unleash the final terrible secrets of the Daedra. They were ready for the fight of their lives. But history records something different. Theorists argue over her end. Did the Daedra, their pacts fulfilled or perhaps broken, finally come to collect their due? Did they simply unplug her, her soul dragged screaming into Cold Harbour or the Deadlands? Or, as other fans suggest, was it more pathetic? Was Potema, for all her magic, still fundamentally mortal? When Sephiros's mages finally cut her off from her magical power source, did she simply starve? Did that magically prolonged body, fueled for decades by hate and stolen souls, suddenly remember that it was in fact over 100 years old? Did she just collapse, a withered, forgotten old woman, betrayed not by a hero but by her own human frailty? The legionaries didn't know, and they didn't care. They just wanted it to be over. They reached the central chamber, the nexus of her power. It was not a throne room, it was a pit, a filth-strewn cavern, dominated by a massive scorched circle on the floor. The remnants of her final desperate rituals were everywhere, and in the corner, slumped against the damp stone, was a figure. It wasn't a queen, it wasn't a lich. The Wolf Queen, Potema Septim, died alone in the catacombs. Her physical reign, which had begun in the splendour of the imperial city and flourished in the power of Solitude, ended here, in the cold, the dark, and the filth. The in-game history, the Wolf Queen verse 7, confirms what Sephiros and his men found. They did not find a monster. They found a withered old woman. She was slumped on a pile of rotting furs, a skeleton draped in desiccated skin, her hair a long white matted tangle. Her eyes were open, staring at the far wall, frozen in an expression of what? Rage, surprise, or just emptiness? Sephiros approached, his sword held low. His men fanned out, checking every shadow, every alcove, terrified that this was the final, most terrible trap. But there was no magic, no ambush. She was just dead. The emperor stood over the body of his sister for a long time. This was the woman who had torn the empire apart, the woman who had murdered his niece, Kintira, the woman who had cost him his youth, his peace, and hundreds of thousands of lives. He felt nothing, just the crushing weight of a lifetime of war. The triumph he had dreamed of for a decade was not there. There was only this pathetic, shriveled thing. "Sir," the Nord sergeant asked, his voice echoing in the chamber, "is it done?" Sephiros looked at the corpse. All that power, all that ambition, all that hate, and this was the result, a dry husk in a wet hole. It was the ultimate bitter joke. All those years of siege, all those dead legionaries, and she had probably been dead for weeks, just sitting down here, rotting, while her mindless undead constructs carried on her war upstairs. "It's done," Sephiros said, his voice flat. He turned to his men. "Get the oil, all of it. I want nothing left of her but ash." They doused the body. They doused the chamber. They doused the entire catacomb as they retreated. The Emperor himself, in his final act of duty to his family, threw the torch. The fire caught with a whoosh, the dark magic clinging to the walls, acting as an accelerant, and the catacombs of Solitude became a raging inferno. They sealed the entrance, carving wards of arche into the stone. The siege was over. The Wolf Queen was dead. Her physical reign had ended in fire and filth. But as Sephiros and his men marched out of the smoking ruin of Solitude, out onto the frozen hills, the Emperor could not shake a feeling. He had burned her body. He had scoured her lair. But as he looked back, he had the distinct, terrible feeling that the hate she had cultivated was too strong to be contained by mere fire. Her body was gone. She was not. Emperor Sepphoris did not leave Solitude immediately. He couldn't. The city was a biohazard, a spiritual wound, and a strategic ruin. His legionaries, the cleansers, spent months in the smoking, haunted shell of the city, performing the grim work of rebuilding. It was less a construction project and more of a mass exorcism. They had to individually bless and reconsecrate every single stone of the Blue Palace. The catacombs were sealed, not just with mortar, but with the most powerful wards the Imperial battle mages and the priests of Arche could devise. They walled off the very section where Potema had made her final stand, hoping that stone and magic could contain a hatred that powerful. The living, or rather the survivors, were a harder problem. There were a few hundred mortals found huddled in cellars, in hidden attics, in sewer pipes. They were pale, starving and half mad from a decade of sheer, unrelenting terror. They were the larder that Potema's monsters had been slowly thinning. They were broken. Sepphoris had them evacuated, sent to temples in the south for healing, though it's doubtful any of them ever truly recovered. Who could? Sepphoris's victory was ash in his mouth. He had won. He was emperor of a Tamriel that was bankrupted, depopulated by plague and war, and deeply scarred. He spent the rest of his life, a mere 9 years, trying to stitch the empire back together. He was a general, not a politician, and the work exhausted him. He died on his feet, a man worn down to a nub by duty. His brother Magnus, the last of the 4 siblings, took the throne. Magnus had been the scholar, the diplomat. He was a good man, and he continued Sepphoris's work of healing. But he too was old, and the war had taken its toll. His reign was short, but he had one crucial duty. He had a son who would inherit the whole bloody mess. This son was Pelagius Septim III, and here the curse of the Wolf Queen shows its true insidious genius. Pelagius III was not some distant cousin. Pelagius III had been born in Solitude. He was the son of a high-ranking noble family in Potema's court before the war had even begun. When Potema began her purge, Pelagius's father, sensing the way the wind was blowing, had managed to smuggle his wife and young son out of the city, fleeing to Magnus's court in High Rock. Think about that. Pelagius III, the future emperor, spent the first, most formative years of his life in the Blue Palace, breathing the very air that Potema was saturating with her rage, her dark pacts, and her creeping necromancy. He was a child playing in the halls while in the basement the Wolf Queen was binding Daedra. When Magnus died, Pelagius III ascended to the Ruby Throne, and all of Tamriel realized very quickly that something was wrong. He would not be known to history as Pelagius the Pious or Pelagius the Great. He would be known, simply and forever, as Pelagius the Mad. His reign was a catastrophe of a different colour. It wasn't the cynical, debauched rot of his uncle Antiochus. It was the unpredictable, terrifying chaos of a broken mind. At first, it was just eccentricity. He would wear missmates' boots to state dinners. He would speak only in grunts for weeks at a time. He once famously insisted on sweeping the entire White Gold Tower himself, claiming the dust was plotting against him. The Elder Council was concerned. Then the eccentricity curdled. He became paranoid. He would accuse courtiers of trying to assassinate him with poisonous thoughts. He had a duke executed because he didn't like the man's face. He would hold long, one-sided conversations with a small, inanimate statue, which he claimed was the only advisor he could trust. The in-game book The Madness of Pelagius records his difficulties. He would fly into rages, biting his own council members. He tried to outlaw beards. He once declared war on the kingdom of Hammerfell, and when his general asked why, Pelagius responded, "Because it is sandy." The general, a very practical man, quietly moved a legion to the border, waited 2 weeks, told the emperor they had won, and Pelagius gave him a medal. The man was, to use the clinical term, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. This brings us to the most enduring fan theory of all, the one that ties the entire bloody history of Solitude together. Was Pelagius born mad, or was he made mad? The Septim bloodline was always a bit spicy, prone to extremes. But Pelagius's madness was special. It was theatrical. It was cosmic. The prevailing theory is that this was Potema's true final victory. She couldn't have the throne, she couldn't have her son, but she could poison the throne for everyone who came after. She had laid a curse, not on the stone of the palace, but on the bloodline itself. And Pelagius, her nephew, the child who'd been right there, marinating in her aura, was the perfect vessel. His madness was her final posthumous laugh, a dagger in the heart of the family that had defeated her. She had turned the very symbol of their victory, the new, unified line of succession, into a raving, drooling lunatic. His reign was mercifully short. The empire simply couldn't function. He was, in a quiet political coup, declared unfit to rule. His wife, the beautiful and infinitely patient Dunmer noble Kintira, was made empress regent. She would rule in his stead, and she was so good at it, so beloved, that she was later canonized as a saint. She deserves it. Imagine being married to that. Pelagius III was sent away, not to a prison, not to an execution. He was sent to a private asylum in the heart of Tamriel. There, he lived out his days, reportedly in a padded cell, where he finally found some measure of peace, spending his last years in a long, detailed argument with a bucket. He died, and the empire breathed a sigh of relief. But the city of Solitude, the city remembered. It was rebuilt. The Jarls returned. The bards. College, in a brave act of defiance, reopened its doors, determined to bring song back to a place of silence. New people moved in, people who hadn't lived through the terror. The economy recovered. On the surface, it was once again the proud capital of Halfengar. But the stain was still there. You could feel it. The locals knew not to go into the catacombs. The Hall of the Dead always seemed a little busier than it should be. And in the Blue Palace, in the very wing where Pelagius the Mad had been born, no one stayed. Servants would quit. Strange noises, muffled screams, a feeling of profound, cold rage. It all lingered. Potema's body was ash. Her son was dust. Her armies were gone. But her hate remained, a dark, psychic poison, soaked into the very stones of her city. And it was just waiting for someone stupid or ambitious or desperate enough to come looking. The rebuilding of Solitude was a triumph of mortal stubbornness. People, as it turns out, really like prime real estate, and a city perched on a magnificent stone arch overlooking the sea is just too good to abandon, even if its foundations are soaked in blood, terror, and necromantic residue. The Imperial Legion, having done its grim duty, marched south, leaving a small garrison and a very, very long list of do-not-touch warnings. The catacombs, of course, were sealed, not just with a door and a no-trespassing sign, but with the most potent magical wards, locks, and spiritual barriers Sephiroth's mages could conjure. It was the ancient Tamrielic equivalent of building a nuclear waste containment facility, a massive, magical sarcophagus designed to hold the seething psychic radiation of the Wolf Queen's hatred. Guaranteed for 10,000 years, the mages probably said, crossing their fingers behind their backs. Don't chip the paint. And so the centuries passed. The Third Era ticked by. The Septim dynasty, forever scarred by the war and the madness of Pelagius III, continued. Emperors came and went. The Oblivion Crisis tore the continent apart, and the Septim line ended in fire and sacrifice. The Third Era gave way to the Fourth, and through it all Solitude stood. It became a city once more. The Bard's College, in an act of almost comical optimism, reopened. They filled the air with song, trying desperately to drown out the faint, discordant hum that seemed to come from the stones themselves. It's hard to get through a rousing rendition of Ragnar the Red when you keep feeling a sudden, inexplicable urge to reanimate a goat. Merchants returned, the docks bustled, and Jarls once again held court in the Blue Palace. But the city was wrong. Everyone knew it, even if they didn't say it. The winters in Halfengar were always a little colder than anywhere else. The fog was a little thicker, and the Blue Palace was a problem. Specifically, the entire western wing of the palace was bad. This was the wing where Pelagius the Mad had been born. This was the wing that overlooked the sealed entrance to the catacombs. This was, for all intents and purposes, the magical Ground Zero. Jarls tried to use it. Of course they did. It was prime square footage. One Jarl in the Second Era tried to make it his personal quarters, He lasted 3 nights. He was found on the 4th morning naked in the palace courtyard, trying to build a nest out of mud and twigs, claiming the walls were whispering arithmetic. He was quietly retired to a farm upstate. Another Jarl in the Third Era tried to turn it into a grand library. The books, according to the terrified scribes, would rearrange themselves. They didn't spell out "get out." That would be crude. They would just form sentences. Very, very dark sentences. Tomes on restoration magic would find themselves shelved next to books on Daedric summoning, as if in suggestion. Eventually they just gave up. The Jarl of Solitude in the year 397 officially ordered the wing sealed. The doors were barred, the windows shuttered. It became known, in hushed tones, as the Pelagius Wing. It was a memorial to the mad emperor, and a permanent festering reminder of the thing that slept beneath the city. It was the ultimate do not disturb sign, and it was the one part of the palace that everyone, from the Jarl to the lowliest kitchen hand, respected. This kind of spiritual staining isn't unique, though Solitude is the most extreme example. The in-game book The Apparitions of the Mages Guild, found in Oblivion, discusses the nature of magical echoes. It states that great and terrible spells, or profound acts of suffering and death, can leave an imprint on a place. Potema's final decade was not just a terrible spell. It was a symphony of suffering and death, played at full volume for 10 solid years. She hadn't just left an imprint, she had burned her soul into the very bedrock of the city like a psychic photograph. This brings us to the great lingering fan debate about the nature of her curse. Is Potema consciously haunting Solitude, or is the city just haunted? Is the difference between a sentient ghost and a psychic recording? One side argues that Potema, the person, is long gone. Her soul was either destroyed, claimed by the Daedra she bartered with, or simply dissipated. What's left in Solitude is just an echo, a radiation burn of her hate. The Pelagius Wing isn't haunted by her. It's haunted by the memory of her rage, replaying itself like a broken record, which is what drove her nephew mad. The other side, the much scarier side, argues that she is absolutely 100% still there. She is conscious, she's aware, she's that same brilliant, hateful mind, trapped in the sealed-off catacombs, her spirit bound to the place of her final failure. For centuries she has been aware, stewing in her own rage, listening to the footsteps of the living in her palace. She's been watching generations of Jarls sit on her throne, and she has been, with all the focus of her immortal will, pushing at the wards, pushing at the stone, pushing at the minds of the weak. For centuries the wards held. They were the masterpiece of Sephiroth's mages, the strongest magic of the age. But magic, like stone, erodes. The world changed. The Oblivion Crisis, at the end of the Third Era, was a global cataclysm that weakened the barriers between worlds. For a few terrible weeks, the entire planet was a Daedric playground. And while the heroes were busy saving the world in Cyrodiil, that surge of chaotic energy, it must have been a jolt to the system for Potema, a little taste of power, a crack in the concrete. Then came the Fourth Era, the Great War, the Aldmeri Dominion, the White Gold Concordat, and finally, the Stormcloak Rebellion. Skyrim was once again soaked in blood. Civil war, rage, paranoia, death. It was all happening again. It was a feast. All that negative energy, all that misery, it was food. It was the solvent that was finally, after all these centuries, dissolving the ancient wards. The haunting began to change. It was no longer just a cold feeling and a creepy vibe. Things got active. In the Blue Palace, servants would hear voices, not just whispers, but clear, commanding voices, speaking in a long-dead dialect. Guards patrolling the sealed Pelagius Wing would be found in the morning, their hair turned white, babbling about a woman made of shadow and cold. Down in the city, in the Hall of the Dead, the priests of Archay, whose job it is to ensure the dead stay dead, were getting nervous. Their blessings weren't sticking. The bodies of the recently deceased seemed restless. The Wolf Queen was waking up. Her spirit, energized and empowered by the chaos of the Fourth Era, was no longer just a stain. It was an arm, reaching out from the dark, looking for a hand to grasp. It was looking for a way out. And in a city full of ambitious, desperate, and foolish mortals, it was only a matter of time before someone was stupid enough to reach back. The call, of course, was answered. The darkness that had been reaching out from the sealed catacombs finally found a hand reaching back, and as is so often the case in Tamriel, it wasn't the hand of a great king or a powerful jarl. It was the hand of a small, ambitious, and profoundly stupid cult. The Fourth Era was in full bloody swing. The Stormcloak Rebellion was tearing Skyrim in two. This new civil war, just like the ancient War of the Red Diamond, was acting as a battery, supercharging the ambient despair and violence of the province. The ancient wards that Sephirus's mages had placed, already worn thin by time and the Oblivion crisis, were now flaking away. The psychic prison was failing. In Solitude, Jarl Elisif the Fair, widow of High King Torrig, held her sad, fragile court in the Blue Palace. She was a good woman, pious and gentle, which made her the political equivalent of a sweet roll in a bear cave. Her court was a nest of anxiety, paranoia, and imperial legates trying to manage the war. Her steward, a practical, overworked man named Folk Firebeard, was the one actually running the hold, drowning in a sea of logistics, bandit reports, and dragon sightings. Into this mess came a man named Varnius Junius. He was a local, sent out on a routine inspection of some old watchtowers. He came back days later, pale, shaking, and smelling faintly of terror. He babbled to Folk about a place called Wolfskull Cave, a name that really should have been a red flag for the entire hold of Harfengar. Varnius reported things, lights, chanting, a ritual, he said. He spoke of necromancers, of an organised military-style presence. He was the man who cried wolf, but everyone deep in their gut knew this wolf was real. Folk Firebeard, a man who already had 10 critical problems for every hour in the day, now had an 11th. This is, of course, where the Dragonborn walks in. The wandering, freelance demigod, the ultimate problem solver, arrived in the Blue Palace, likely just looking for a bounty or a place to sell some looted cheese wheels. Folk, seeing an opportunity to outsource this particular nightmare, flagged them down. "I've got a problem," he'd say, with the weary sigh of a man who has seen too much. "Varnius here says there's necromancers in Wolfskull Cave. Probably just some amateurs," he lies, to himself as much as to the Dragonborn. "Go, take care of it." The Dragonborn, for whom clearing out a cave of necromancers is the Fourth Era equivalent of running to the store for milk, accepted. A few hundred septims, an easy job. The journey to Wolfskull Cave was unsettling. The place wasn't on any main road. It was hidden, a dark moor in the side of a mountain, overlooking the sea. And as the Dragonborn approached, they could feel it. That same unnatural cold that clung to the Pelagius wing. That same sense of being watched. The cave was not occupied by some amateurs. The first thing the Dragonborn found was a lot of dead Draugr. Not Draugr that had been raised by the necromancers, but Draugr that had been evicted. The necromancers had stormed this ancient tomb and killed the ancient undead occupants to take it from them. This was not a hobby. This was a hostile takeover. The cave system was vast, winding down and up into the ruins of an ancient collapsed watchtower that had been built into the mountain itself, and it was swarming. The necromancers were organised. They wore matching grim robes. They had sentries, patrols. They fought with a cold, disciplined fury. These were not mages dabbling in forbidden arts. These were soldiers. They were a cult. And the chanting was everywhere. A deep, resonant, malevolent hum that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The Dragonborn, as is their way, began the process of violent, systematic disassembly. They cut their way through the outer chambers, their sword or magic tearing through the dark-robed mages. But as they climbed the ruined tower inside the cavern, the chanting grew louder, more focused. It was a ritual, a big one. They reached the top, a high, broad platform open to a stormy sky above. And they saw it. It was a scene from a nightmare. A dozen of the most powerful necromancers, the summoners as they called themselves, stood in a circle. In the centre, a vortex of roiling, purple-black energy was opening, a direct conduit to somewhere. The mages were chanting, their arms raised, pouring their magicka into the vortex, stabilising it, widening it. And then, a voice. A woman's voice. Not from one of the mages, but from the vortex itself. It was ancient, imperious, and filled with a triumphant, centuries-old rage. "Yes, yes! Return me! Serve me in death, as you served me in life!" It was Potema, This was it. The moment she had waited for. The stupid, ambitious mortal she had been whispering to had finally figured out how to ring the dinner bell. An in-game necromancer's journal found in the cave lays out the cult's horrifyingly arrogant plan. They weren't just worshippers trying to bring back their glorious queen. They were, in their own minds, masters. They believed Potema's spirit was a raw, untamed force of nature, a battery of pure necromantic power. Their plan was to summon her, yes, but then to bind her, to trap her powerful spirit into a prepared vessel, likely a reanimated corpse of some powerful warrior, and then command her, using her as the ultimate controllable superweapon. This, of course, is the central debated point. The fan community is united in the belief that these necromancers were the biggest fools in the history of Skyrim. Their plan was the magical equivalent of trying to put a leash on a hurricane. They thought they could control Potema, who had toyed with Daedric princes, Potema who had held an entire city hostage for a decade after her death. Potema whose very rage had driven her nephew insane. They weren't summoning a weapon. They were opening the door for their own butcher. The Dragonborn, seeing the swirling vortex of bad news, did what they do best. They interrupted. The fight was a chaotic, desperate brawl on a high platform. The master necromancers, led by a single powerful ritual master, threw everything they had at the interloper. But as the Dragonborn cut them down, one by one, the ritual began to fail. The vortex sputtered. The chanting broke. "No!" the voice from the void shrieked. It was no longer triumphant. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "Do not fail me. I will not be denied." The Dragonborn cut down the final ritual master. The vortex, its anchors severed, collapsed in on itself with a sound like a dying star. Potema's voice gave one last, echoing scream of pure, bottomless frustration, a sound that would give the Dragonborn nightmares for a week. "No!" And then, silence. The wind howled through the ruined tower. The few remaining skeletons clattered to the ground, their strings cut. The summoning had been stopped. The Dragonborn, probably needing a stiff mead, travelled back to Solitude. They found Folk Firebeard. Problem solved. It was definitely necromancers. They were trying to summon Potema. Folk's face, already a mask of perpetual stress, went white. What? Wolf Queen Potema? Here? Now? He wasn't just alarmed. He was terrified. He knew what this meant. This wasn't the end. This was the prologue. He paid the Dragonborn, his hands shaking. You did well, but you didn't stop her. You just delayed her. You've shown her the door is unlocked." Folk was right. The ritual at Wolfskull Cave had failed. But it had succeeded in one critical way. It had focused Potema. It had pulled her lingering, ambient spirit from the stones of Solitude and given it a target, a purpose. She was no longer just a haunting. She was an active threat. The Wolf Queen was awake. She was angry. And now, she was coming home. It didn't take long. The Dragonborn, perhaps having just returned from a dragon-slaying expedition or a mundane trip to the market, was found by a courier. Not just any courier, but a man who looked like he'd sprinted the entire way from Solitude, his face slick with panic. The letter was from Folk Firebeard, its seal cracked by a trembling hand. It was short. "It's worse. The Hall of the Dead. Come back, now." When the Dragonborn arrived at the Blue Palace, Folk Firebeard looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He wasn't in the throne room. He was in the kitchens, clutching a mug of cold coffee, his eyes wide. "You're back. Good. Good." He didn't have time for pleasantries. "The hauntings? They've escalated. After your adventure at Wolfskull Cave, things went quiet. We thought you'd stopped it." He shook his head, a grim, tired motion. "You didn't stop it, Dragonborn. You just focused it. You kicked the nest. The hauntings in the palace are worse than ever. The Pelagius wing is... I think it's breathing, but that's not the problem. The problem is the Hall of the Dead. Styr, the priest of Archay. He sent for you. He's the one who understands. Please, go. See him." Styr was not a man given to panic. He was a priest of Archay, the god of the life and death cycle. He dealt in the inevitable. But when the Dragonborn found him, he was standing before a massive, ancient, magically sealed door in the depths of the Hall of Dead. a place that was becoming increasingly poorly named. Styr was performing a blessing, his hands glowing, and the ancient door was shuddering, as if something on the other side were pounding on it. "Dragonborn," he said, not turning, "you have arrived, and not a moment too soon." He explained the terrible, horrifying truth. The quest, the Wolf Queen Awakened, reveals the true nature of the problem. The necromancers at Wolfskull Cave, in their arrogance, had attempted to summon Potema's spirit. They had failed to bind her, but they had succeeded in calling her. They had acted as a spiritual lighthouse guiding her consciousness, which had been dispersed for centuries back to its anchor. And what was its anchor? Her remains. "When Sepphoris and his men burned her," Styr whispered, his voice grim, "they were mostly successful. But some parts, her skull, her bones, they were too saturated with her power. They could not be destroyed. They were sealed in this, the most ancient part of the catacombs, behind the strongest wards the Empire could muster." The pounding on the door grew louder, a sound like a giant fist striking stone. "The wards have failed," Styr said, his voice flat. "Your interruption at Wolfskull Cave, it was the final blow. Her spirit, fully conscious, has returned. She is down there. She is reunited with her bones. She is no longer just a haunting Dragonborn. She is regrouping. She is raising an army, not of echoes, but of the real dead. The Draugr, the vampires, everything that has festered in this mountain for 1,000 years. She's trying to become corporeal again." He turned, his eyes finding the Dragonborns. "You must go in. You must stop her. You must fight your way to her ritual chamber, destroy the ghost, and bring me her remains. It is the only way to sever her final tie. It is the only way to give this city peace." He handed the Dragonborn a single ancient iron key. It was cold to the touch. The Dragonborn, with that sigh that must be permanent by now, put the key in the lock. The magical barriers hissed, popped, and died. The great stone door slid open. The air that rolled out was not just cold, it was ancient. It was the smell of a tomb that had been sealed for 4,000 years, a tomb that was suddenly furiously awake. The descent was a journey into history. This was not the simple Hall of the Dead. This was her world, and she was talking to them. Her voice, the same one from the cave, now echoed from every wall, a constant overlapping whisper of taunts and commands. "A little hero," she hissed, her voice sounding like splintering ice. "Come to clean up the mess. My brothers were fools, just like you. They thought fire could stop me. They thought stone could hold me." The Dragonborn fought. The first enemies were Draugr, but not the normal dusty kind. These were her Draugr. Their eyes glowed with that same cold blue light. They fought with a purpose, a cold intelligence, guarding the halls of their queen. Deeper, through winding, trap-filled corridors, the Dragonborn found the court. In one of the great central chambers, the Dragonborn came upon a horrifying tableau. A massive vaulted hall set for a feast. Dozens of skeletons, draped in the rotted finery of the Third Era, were seated around a great stone table. Her court. They had followed her into undeath, and for centuries they had been sitting here, waiting for her return. As the Dragonborn entered, they all stood up, in perfect, silent unison, their empty sockets turning, and they drew their ancient rusted swords. "My subjects are so loyal," Potema's voice crooned as the Dragonborn was forced to shatter her ghostly court. "They serve me in death, as they served me in life. Will you serve me, little hero? Your soul is strong. You would make a fine Death Lord." The Dragonborn fought through vampires, her honoured guests. They fought through spectral Draugr, echoes of her most powerful ancient Nords. And finally they reached the final door. It opened into a vast natural cavern, dominated by a ritual altar. And there she was, her spirit. It was not the withered old woman Sepphoris had found. That was just the body she had discarded. This was Potema, a swirling spectral entity of pure cold rage, draped in the ghostly tatters of her armour, her face a mask of furious glowing energy. She was magnificent, and she was terrifying. On the altar behind her, there it was, a single, blackened, ancient skull, her last anchor. "You have come far," she thundered, her voice now coming from the entity itself. "But this is my throne room, and you will be my first new soldier." The fight was, to put it mildly, difficult. Potema was not a simple ghost. She was a demigod of undeath. She teleported around the room, blasting the Dragonborn with frost and lightning that could strip flesh from bone. She raised a constant, unending legion of Draugr, pulling them from the very walls, forcing the Dragonborn to fight a two-front war. This, of course, is the final fan debate. What exactly was that ghost? Was it truly the soul of Potema Septim fighting for her final chance at resurrection? Or, as some argue, was it the ultimate echo, the final sentient psychic remnant of her power, an elemental of pure hate that had gained its own consciousness, bound to her remains? The general consensus is that this was her. This was the Wolf Queen, in all her spectral glory, making her last, defiant, arrogant stand. But the Dragonborn was the Dragonborn. They were a force of nature that Potema had never, in all her centuries, accounted for. A soul of a dragon, in the body of a mortal. With a final earth-shattering shout, perhaps unrelenting force, perhaps fire breath, the Dragonborn struck the spectral form. There was a moment of absolute silence. The ghost of Potema froze. She looked surprised, and then, with a shriek that was not angry, not triumphant, but simply final, she dissolved. The blue light which had filled the room snapped back to its source, into the skull on the altar, and then extinguished. Silence. The rattling of bones ceased. The whispering voices stopped. The unnatural, crushing cold lifted. It was just a cave. The Dragonborn, breathing heavily, walked to the altar. They picked up the skull of Potema. It was just a bone. It was over. They returned to Styr, who was waiting by the now open door, his face etched with anxiety. He saw the skull in the Dragonborn's hand, and for the first time in what was probably 50 years, the man's knees buckled in relief. You've done it. Arke's mercy, you've done it." He took the skull, handling it as if it were a piece of pure poison. I will take this. It will be consecrated, it will be purified, and it will be destroyed, properly this time. You have saved Solitude, Dragonborn. You have let the Wolf Queen die. And so, the long, dark, and exceptionally bloody chronicle of the Wolf Queen finally ends. Styr, true to his word, took those last mortal fragments, the skull that had housed that brilliant, terrible mind, and he purified them with the sacred fires of Arke. The final anchor that had tied Potema's hateful spirit to the world of the living was, at last, incinerated. The change in Solitude was not immediate, but it was profound. It was like a migraine which had been pressing on the city for centuries had finally subsided. The bards playing in their college found their songs sounded clearer, brighter. The unnatural cold in the Harfinger marshes receded, becoming just regular, boring, northern Skyrim cold. And in the Blue Palace, the Pelagius wing, which had been sealed for an age, was just a wing, a dusty, old, forgotten part of the palace, no longer breathing, no longer whispering. The stain was gone. The Wolf Queen was no longer a looming threat. She was, at last, what she should have been all along. A memory, a lesson, a truly terrifying piece of history. Her story serves as a reminder that ambition, when it is not tempered by empathy, is a fire that consumes everything. The world, the family, and finally, the self. And her hate, so powerful it defied death for an entire era, was finally undone. Not by an emperor, not by an army, but by a single, wandering adventurer who probably just wanted a few hundred septims and a warm bed. The great bloody history of Solitude is now closed. The city is at peace, and you, fellow adventurer, are now at the end of your journey. The shadows have all been named, the monsters have been put to rest. There is nothing left to fear tonight.